Welcome to Guerrilla History again. We're looking at the rise of capitalism, and in particular at how capitalism, far from being an imposition from above by the oppressive ruling classes, was a revolution from below, carried through by the lower orders. In my last film I looked at the decline of serfdom, which happened in England, and which is such a key part of the development of capitalism there. But there was one bit I left out: the guilds. The what? The guilds. Remember the guilds? I did a film on the guilds recently, on the devastating effect they had on economic activity and have had throughout the whole of human history. Please watch it if you haven't. Capitalism could never have happened if the guilds had clung on to their power. So, what happened to the guilds in England? Along with the inability of the lords to keep peasants in bondage, went the failure of the guilds to restrict their economic activities. In England, many newly freed peasants set up in competition against the guilds. We're talking black market activity here, illicit production, effectively waging a guerrilla economic war against them. And they succeeded. And this is key. As Professor Sheila Ogilvy, the great authority on guilds, points out, England became exceptional in Europe in having no effective rural guild control. Let's see how this happened. Already from 1350, shortly before the Peasants' Revolt, as peasants were shaking off the bonds of serfdom, the illicit production of woolens and other goods in England was spreading. Increasingly non-guild peasant producers replicated the styles of the expensive guild output, but at a fraction of the cost, addressing and fostering a mass market. In this black market production, by the way, women, who had been doubly excluded from guilds, both as serfs and as women, began to shine. As Professor Ogilvy describes, non-gilded women evidently made cloths good enough to entice customers away from gilded weavers who attacked non-gilded women as dangerous competitors. In this black market revolution that so undermined the guilds, it was the illicit production of cloth that led the way. Cloth, after shelter and food, was the most sought-after commodity in pre-modern times. So how did it happen? You can imagine, even as a free peasant, the difficulties you'd encounter as an upstart producer of cloth. Peasants sat idle when they did not have and could not afford raw wool to work up. Acquiring looms and other capital equipment was a great expense, beyond the reach of many. Spinners needed to sell their yarn to a neighbour or at market before buying more carded wool. Acquiring raw materials and selling finished work might involve breaking away from work to travel a great distance to town or fairs to deal in small quantities of material at a time when travelling any distance was no small thing. As a result of all this, existence was hand-to-mouth. Isolated peasant craftsmen struggled to get ahead of the game. But the market, unhampered by guild restraint, which is to say human ingenuity motivated by the desire to make some money, found a way around these obstacles. This is the story of the middlemen. A rural producer for a small cut would volunteer to buy and sell for others while they were at market. Over time, for some individuals, this sporadic activity evolved into a full-time occupation. In historical records, these new middlemen are described as chapmen, broggers, hucksters, or mercators, merchants. These illicit non-guild chapmen grew to become small-scale, independent, travelling merchants, selling raw wool to cottagers, buying from them finished yarn or cloth, and also selling to them items such as penny parcels of spices brought from far-off markets. Enterprising chapmen went further. A peasant, of course, might not have the cash to buy raw materials, so chapmen started lending them the raw materials they needed, collecting from them the finished product, and paying them for their work on the spot, the so-called putting out system. Chapmen began to lend, hire or sell the cottagers spinning wheels and looms so that they could work more effectively. These middlemen, so despised by lords and guilds, gave ordinary peasants access to credit, materials, tools, and to the market itself. And thanks to them, rural production took off. Professor Ogilvy writes, guilds rapidly lost out to free producers outside the walls of the town, from which most industrial growth emanated. Guilds didn't just lose business, they lost their workers. As Professor Bolton describes, the journeyman with no hope of setting up on his own, the apprentice tired of working out his long term of training and providing his master with cheap labour, might be tempted to migrate and set up on his own in the suburbs or in the countryside and join the growing band of rural industrial workers. This early form of capitalist production, illicit and driven by peasant producers, had revolutionary implications. Traders in the larger towns including the London livery companies, found that they could buy cloth better and cheaper from black market spinners, weavers and fullers who lived in the countryside, in hamlets away from the towns operating beyond the reach of guild control. Selling illicit goods in guild-controlled towns, of course, was tricky. Towns were surrounded by walls, with gates guarded by guild toll officers. So to buy and sell non-guild produce, there came into being illicit markets. Black market fairs sprang up across England with no formal recognition, with no official license. We know little about what went on in many of them because, as Professor Poston says, markets of this kind were often concealed from our view by their very informal nature. But we do know that the number and size of these markets grew, and they became unstoppable, to the extent that illicit markets started to operate right outside the walls of guild-controlled towns and cities, as if to taunt them. These free markets became known as liberties. By Tudor times, most chartered towns had vibrant liberties right outside the city walls, beyond the control of the guilds. Journeymen and apprentices abandoned the regulated city of London for the nearby unregulated liberties of Southwark, Lambeth and Bermondsey. City brickmakers escaped to the liberty of Islington, the heat from all the kilns there making it popular with rough sleepers. At first the liberties served relatively local needs, but increasingly they attracted travelling merchants looking to buy produce for sale elsewhere and to sell products from elsewhere. Foreign goods, which the guilds would have forbidden or heavily taxed. Even guild members and their families were drawn to the liberties by the range of goods on offer, unwilling to pay the inflated prices charged by other guilds. Townsfolk teemed into the liberties to purchase cheaper, better products, to drink and eat, to go to theatres, which were forbidden elsewhere, to watch plays, which were forbidden elsewhere, and to buy illicit books, which the guilds had censored. Soon across England we find liberties growing from small isolated markets into regular, uncharted, unregulated market towns. These unregulated towns thrived, while the neighbouring guild-controlled towns shrank and withered. Guild-controlled towns like Beverley and Bridgnorth fell into terminal decline, at the very same time as unregulated centres like Birmingham and Wolverhampton, Leeds and Halifax began to grow into great dynamic towns. In Lancashire, guild-controlled towns like Lancaster, Wigan and Preston were usurped by the unlicensed upstarts Manchester, Bury, Bolton and Rochdale. As the Marxist Christopher Hill observes, it was the lack of guild control that explains the huge success of metal industries in and around unregulated Birmingham. Economic activity flowed to these unregulated towns not because labour was cheap there. Quite the contrary. Free market wages in the liberties and free towns were far higher than the pittances paid out by guildmasters to their wretched exploited journeymen and apprentices, if indeed they received pay at all. As one traveller around England observed, we daily see manufacturers leaving places where wages are low and removing to where they are high. This free market revolution was a godsend to the lower orders, and was driven by the lower orders against the establishment. It came as an unwelcome shock to the ruling elite. Not only had the crown, nobility and church lost their serfs, they were now losing their protection money from the guilds. York, which had been by far the biggest northern city in the Middle Ages, firmly under guild control, found its population contract and its income decimated, to the point that its guilds could no longer pay their customary taxes and fees either to the crown or church or the local lord, the Earl of Rutland. The exodus of people was such that of York's 40 medieval churches, 15 had to be destroyed for lack of parishioners. The Earl saw his revenues cut in half. Why did this happen in England, but not elsewhere? On continental Europe, other than in the Netherlands, of which more later, the authorities were able to use armed force to prevent the serfs from winning their freedom, and also to support the guilds and stamp out illicit markets. In Europe, the guilds were far more successful in imposing their regulations, both in the towns and on the rural masses, beyond the walls of towns and cities, stifling the development of rural, non-guild craft production. For the guilds in England, well, it didn't help that England is an island. Trade conducted along Europe's long rivers was easier for the guilds to monitor, block and tax. It was far harder for the guilds to check the illicit traffic of goods and people around England's open coastal waters. But why else? Why did the English ruling authorities not attempt to stop this? Why did they not do more to stop serfs running away? Why did they not clamp down on runaway serfs demanding to work as free men? Why were the liberties not stamped out? Why did the guilds fail so emphatically to exert their authority outside the towns? The authorities in England did try to clamp down. From the Statute of Labourers onwards, they tried time and time again, in one frustrated statute after another. As late as the 16th century, when serfdom was effectively dead and rural production rampant, the authorities were still trying to shore up the power of the guilds. There were still laws being decreed in 1545 and 1552 to outlaw middlemen in an effort to choke off rural cloth production. A law of 1555 was decreed to protect the guilds from competition by rural workers, and another forbade country folk from trading in towns except at fairs. Another in 1555 attempted to impose guild rules on rural clothmakers, forbidding them from using more than one woolen loom. Law after law was passed in a vain attempt to suppress wages demanded by free labourers, which were rising at an alarming rate, and to impose guild monopolies of purchasing certain goods and raw materials, with orders that such goods were not to be sold to persons dwelling outside the town. Repeated statutes were aimed at protecting urban industries from rural competition and enlarging and strengthening guilds. And they were still passing statutes hopelessly pointlessly a century later in the Statute of Artificers in 1652, which was a futile attempt to reimpose guild apprenticeship rules, giving justices the power, in theory, to restrict the movement of people and cap wages for almost all classes of worker. But these statutes utterly failed to stem the free market tide. As Professor Dyer puts it, the flow of commerce was more powerful than the efforts of government to control behaviour. Why did these statutes fail? Why were the magistrates, who were so powerful in theory, unable to exercise these powers in practice? The answer is that these statutes were not enforced because the English authorities had no means of enforcing them. They did not stamp out the drift towards free market capitalism because they could not. There was no standing army. An abiding theme in English history was the extraordinary military weakness of the Crown as compared to European monarchs. In the Great English Peasants' Revolt, as we've seen, Richard had very few troops. The Tower of London garrison, his immediate bodyguard, and even these were unreliable, the garrison troops mixing with the rebels. Richard had to appease the rebels, pretending to acquiesce to their demands before tricking and killing their leaders. Even then, there were not enough troops to mount a full-scale revenge assault on disgruntled peasants, as German princes would do later when quashing the German peasant revolt. By the 17th and 18th centuries, it would be a commonplace observation, a basic truth universally acknowledged, that a large standing army represented a mortal threat to liberty. The English populace of the Tudor and Stuart eras had a deep fear that the Crown might succeed in creating a standing army. Why? Because they could see the startling contrast between England, where there was no standing army and people were free, and continental Europe, where absolute monarchs had built vast standing armies and accompanying police forces. To understand this difference between England and Europe, we must look at the nature of arms and warfare in the Middle Ages. In earlier times, if a feudal king wanted an armed force beyond that of his immediate household retinue of knights and soldiers, he would call his nobles, barons, counts, dukes and earls, who owed the crown military service. They in turn would muster their various feudal retinues of lords, knights and squires who owed them military service and would therefore fight under the different banners of their respective dukes and earls. But this primitive feudal levy had its drawbacks. The call-up of knights was time-consuming, their attendance was not always reliable, and the armies thus assembled were relatively small. Many knights were out of condition and not very good at fighting. These feudal bands of effectively warrior thugs were good for skirmishes with other bands of feudal knights and fine for intimidating isolated communities of local serfs, but not much beyond that. In England, medieval kings faced the added problem that their nobles and knights grew reluctant to serve abroad, with too little booty to show for it, fighting over territory which was too far away, in which they had no interest. By the end of King John's reign, English nobles refused to fight for the king anywhere abroad other than Normandy and Brittany. The growth of markets and a money economy suggested and demanded an alternative. Just as the feudal labour dues of serfs began to be commuted into money payment, so the same happened with the military obligations of knights and nobles. Those knights who could not or would not turn up for a battle paid a fine, scutage or shield money. Scutage developed from an occasional fine into a regular tax and was used by the crown to pay knights for their service and to hire mercenaries from abroad. But here again, the English crown struggled. Scutage was not a tax on the defenceless peasantry, but on the armed warrior elite, and so it was not so easy to collect. In England, by the time of King Edward, the collection of scutage became a long-drawn, exasperating process whose returns were hardly worth the labour of investigation. Nor in England could such taxes on the nobility be demanded willy-nilly. The profligacy and adventurism of King John led him to levy the tax too often and too heavily, with the result that the barons demanded, in Magna Carta, that scutage should only be levied with the consent of the Common Council of the realm. In other words, by what would soon be Parliament. By 1362, the English king was having to promise, likewise, only to levy wool taxes with the consent of Parliament. In England, a tight-fisted taxpayers' parliament of nobles, knights and burgesses began to act as a severe drag on the ability of the English crown to raise other taxes over and above customary feudal dues. The story of the rise of England's taxpayers' parliament has been told many times. What is important to note here is that it had no equivalent in those European kingdoms where we find the growth of centralized, authoritarian, absolutist regimes: France, Prussia, Spain, Russia and Austria. There did exist in Europe things called parliaments, but crucially not with the same power to restrict the spending of the monarch. As a result, as we shall see, European monarchs who could tax more or less at will successfully built up vast professional standing armies, which acted as brutal armed domestic police forces. By the 16th century, for example, the French king controlled a standing army of about 60,000. In the 17th century, this would grow to 300,000. England's Tudor monarchs, by contrast, had about 100 yeomen of the guard, another 100 gentlemen pensioners, around 600 troops up north in a fort in Berwick keeping an eye on the Scots, and about 500 spread between Calais and the southern ports keeping an eye out for the French. In effect, nothing. As Professor Palliser says, the Tudors had no standing army or state police. The root of the problem was that ordinary royal revenue was insufficient to pay for a regular standing army. For that, extraordinary revenue voted by Parliament was needed, and parliaments were reluctant to vote adequate sums in peacetime. The social implications of this were enormous. In the 16th century, the English crown was literally powerless to prevent the final collapse of serfdom or the flouting of guild regulation, because it operated with one fundamental limitation which set it apart from its equivalents abroad. It lacked a substantial military apparatus. As Professor Meyer underlines, even Henry VIII had no subservient army, police force or bureaucracy, a fact he rightly says of supreme importance for the development of liberty in England. But it gets worse, or rather even better. And those interested in the origins of America's Second Amendment, please take note. Since there was no state army, in order to protect itself from foreign aggression, the English crown found it necessary, and indeed had done so as early as the 12th century, to allow people, or at least a section of them, to take up arms. In the place of a professional army, the crown relied on the acquiescence of lesser folk, who gathered in arrays of armed militias from the shires. Rightly nervous that arming serfs might backfire, there were stipulations that the kind of arms permitted should be limited according to status. The Assize of Arms of 1181 decreed that every free layman who possesses chattels or rents to the value of 16 marks shall have a shirt of mail, a helmet, a shield, and a lance, and every free layman possessing chattels or rents to the value of 10 marks shall have a hauberk, an iron cap, and a lance. The lower orders, of course, serfs, Jews, and the like, were still forbidden from possessing arms. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, as serfdom in England began to crumble, and as more and more peasants gained the status of free men with property of a certain level, so did the number increase of yeoman militiamen, permitted and even required to bear arms. This allowed the crown to assemble bigger militia bands of yeoman archers, armed with longbows, short swords and daggers, to fight the French in the 100 Years' War, famously at the Battle of Agincourt. But it also meant, crucially, that more and more English commoners were armed. And as the historian G. M. Trevelyan observed, the good yeoman archer was not only the scourge of the French and other enemies, he was also, back in England, a formidable consideration for bailiffs and justices trying to enforce servile dues. In England, the decline of serfdom went hand in hand with a great increase in the spread of arms among the general population, against the backdrop of a weak government. By the Tudor period, England's armed yeoman citizenry was conscious both of their freedom compared to continental Europeans, and also the connection between this freedom and their right to carry arms. The yeomen were held to be the real strength and defence of the realm, writes Trevelyan. Other nations, Englishmen boasted, had no such middle class, but only an oppressed peasantry, and the nobles and men-at-arms who robbed them. And it gets even better. By the 16th century, the arms of the English commoners were not limited to longbows and swords. As muskets replaced the bow as the standard militia weapon, the English yeomen were increasingly armed with guns. By 1541, the authorities in England were expressing concern that the ownership of handguns was spreading widely even among commoners who did not have the minimum property qualification, and laws were passed in an effort to stem the tide. But since no Tudor Parliament agreed to provide money for an armed body to enforce such laws, there was little that could be done to stop it. There was, in short, by the Tudor period, an armed people and a disarmed state. As the great historian Macaulay writes, it was impossible for the Tudors to carry oppression beyond a certain point, for they had no armed force, and they were surrounded by an armed people. Their palace was guarded by a few domestics, whom the array of a single shire or a single ward of London could with ease have overpowered. This lack of armed strength was a restraint stronger than any mere law can impose. Macaulay spells it out. Henry VIII encountered no opposition when he wished to send Buckingham and Surrey, Anne Boleyn and Lady Salisbury to the scaffold, but when, without the consent of Parliament, he demanded of his subjects a contribution of 1/6 their goods, he soon found it necessary to retract. The cry of hundreds of thousands was that they were English and not French, freemen and not slaves. In Kent, the royal commissioners, the tax collectors, fled for their lives. In Suffolk, 4,000 men appeared in arms. The king's lieutenants in that county vainly exerted themselves to raise an army. Those who did not join the insurrection declared that they would not fight against their brethren in such a quarrel. Henry, proud and self-willed as he was, shrank, not without reason, from the conflict that aroused the spirit of the nation. He not only cancelled his illegal commissions, he not only granted a general pardon to all the malcontents, but he publicly and solemnly apologized for his infraction of the laws. This impotence of the state can be seen in everyday life. In the unregulated liberty of Southwark in London, just south of the Thames, there was a row of 12 brothels or stews, which aroused the disapproval of Henry VIII, who was offended by the dissolute and miserable persons who operated and frequented them. In 1546 he proclaimed by sound of trumpet that they should be closed, but to no effect, since Henry had no army or police force to stamp out such activity, and it's recorded that the brothels continued to operate regardless. 30 years later, in the 1580s, we find the Privy Council still calling for the playing and dicing houses within the liberties to be shut down, still with no effect. As Professor Pallister says of the English state, its powers were enormous on paper, but in practice it was often impotent. Its lack of paid officials and law enforcers made its policies far less impressive in reality than on paper. By the age of the Tudors, the authorities did not enforce guild regulations in the countryside because they could not. Law and order was in the hands of ordinary citizens. Assisting the sheriff or local justices of the peace were individual constables who would raise the hue and cry if a crime was committed. A posse comitatus of armed locals would be raised to apprehend the culprit, just like in the old westerns. Nor was the power of the new and up-and-coming yeoman class restricted to armed force, or the implied threat of armed force. In absolutist Europe, monarchs were able to impose Roman law codes. The state exercised control over the legal system. But in England, the crown was too weak. Common law was upheld in England beyond the direct control of the state, and the increasingly confident yeoman class gained ever more influence in the courts. By 1598, common law case decisions were going against the guilds. We find judgments like, the Tailors' Guild Ordinance, though it has the countenance of a charter, was against the common law, because it was against the liberty of the subject. For every subject, by the law, has freedom and liberty to put his cloth to be dressed by what clothmaker he pleases, and cannot be restrained. That would in effect be a monopoly. Another says that, under the common law, no man can be prohibited from working in any lawful trade, since the common law abhors all monopolies. We find judges ruling that a rule of such a nature as to bring all trade and traffic into the hands of one company or one person and to exclude all others is illegal. And a man is not to be restrained that he shall not labour for his living. By 1616, in any case, London had grown so large it could not be fed without the prohibited activities of the much maligned enemies of guild power, the middlemen. By 1634, local magistrates, many of whom were new men, were refusing to enforce apprenticeship restrictions or to prosecute middlemen. By 1621, Francis Bacon could call guilds fraternities of evil, which denied the liberty of the subject. In 1640, the MP John Culpeper described guilds as monopolies, wasps, and vermin. In England, unlike the rest of Europe, feudal regulation, serfdom and guild control crumbled in the face of market forces. And it happened because, unlike in Europe, the ruling classes failed to establish a bureaucratic, centralized state backed by a large professional standing army and police force. It was literally the inability of the English state to enforce its will that led to the collapse of serfdom and led in England to the gradual and piecemeal decline in the power and authority of the guilds, an historical experience significantly different from the rest of Europe. So now the stage is set. We're now ready to look at the first great flowering of capitalism in England. Was it a miserable experience for the lower orders? Did it make them poor? Did it make them miserable? Tune into my next film to find out.